Okay, so we will start, and welcome to the early career joint talk by Ivano Chigani and Nick Bird. I guess we're hosting it, but I will let Liad and Walter take it from here. So please take it away.
Thank you. So just as a starting point, I'll just kind of present the structure of this meeting or this discussion, and then we can take it from there. And Walter will probably start the discussion session, and I will then follow. So today's discussion focuses on the possible role of the posterior alpha activity as the way Nick and Ivano define it, a railroad switcher between the dorsal and ventral pathways. And this might sound very focused, but the implication of this problem are actually widespread, as you will see, touching upon issues of conscious versus unconscious processing and of randomness and order. The way it will work is that first Nick will open with a broad introduction of the overall topic, and then we will move to Ivano, who will present the scientific results, and then go back to Nick to get his take about the philosophical implications of these findings. And then at the last part of this meeting, we'll open the stage for questions and discussions, I guess starting with you, Walter, and then we'll all join. So it's just also an opportunity to thank everyone for joining us, and especially to Nick and Ivano, who are the center of this meeting. And we're very curious to hear what you have to say. Walter and I already know a bit, but I'm sure all the others will enjoy tremendously. So Nick, take it away.
All right, I'm going to hit share. It's giving me an error. I'll try again. All right. So hopefully you can see a slide, and I'll get going in a moment. So as Liad introduced, I'll be kind of doing just a quick preamble, and then I will hand it over to Ivano to give us the data and the methods and the results. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the logic of the underlying argument and some of the implications for 3 different ways to approach the issue. And I'll pose some questions to the scientists and one as well to the philosophers. So just to, I guess, introduce myself, I'm at Stevens Institute of Technology right now. And I'm currently supported by the Intelligence Community Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, in addition to the other things I do, but that's the main thing I'm doing. And thanks for your time at this talk today. So what I want to do is kind of start big picture and fairly relatable. So suppose you're deciding whether to swipe right or to swipe left in your favorite smartphone app. And I'm talking about email, of course, but you know that you have other work to do while you're doing the swiping. So you're sort of keeping track of time while you consciously and deliberately decide whether you should swipe right or left based on what you see on the screen. Now, suppose your swipes are more significant than, say, email. Suppose you're choosing a job or a house or a mate. I hear you can make these kinds of decisions now by like swiping on apps. The question I want to ask is, would those swiping behaviors be free? So you would seem to be consciously deciding whether or not to swipe and in which direction to swipe. And when you intend to swipe, you seem to swipe. And so that might be enough to think that your swiping decisions are free. But what if there are like unconscious processes that preceded your conscious deliberations, and these prior unconscious processes were what actually determined your swiping decisions? Would that undermine your sense of that your swipes are chosen freely? And what if there were smart neuroscientists scanning your brain activity and using that data to predict when and how you'll perform each swipe before you're even aware of when and how you intend to swipe? So by the time you think you've decided to swipe right, for example, the neuroscientists already knew you were going to do it. And their predictions are pretty successful, say near perfect or something like that. Would that undermine your sense that your swipes are chosen freely? Or to just tack on one more question, suppose the scientists have figured out the mechanism for whether you swipe right or left, but as far as they can tell, it's a random process the unconscious processes that you're not aware of that actually determine whether you swipe right or left seems to be functionally random. It's unpredictable and maybe therefore uncontrollable. Certainly something you're not aware of. Would that undermine your sense that these swipes are chosen freely? So many of us are familiar with claims that neuroscience undermines our notions of free will. We know about studies from people like Benjamin Libet and colleagues that are thought to detect neural evidence of something like an intention to do something. In this case, like with your hand. And it seems like the neuroscientists are able to detect this before the participants seem to be aware of what they're intending to do with their hand, is the way the story goes. And even the scientists in these cases seemed to suggest that this challenges certain notions of responsibility or free will. And we're familiar with other names that have echoed this kind of thinking or these forms of arguments. And early in grad school, when I was at Florida State, I more or less accepted this thinking, but upon further reflection, I concluded that there's actually at least one major mistake in my thinking, and I'll explain that mistake in the second half of the talk, but I'm just going to plant that seed now so that you can begin thinking about which objection I've gone with or how I've changed my mind. But for now, I actually want to hand it over to Ivano to give us his great methods and results that maybe continue the tradition of this kind of research.
Thank you. As usual, I will ask if my presentation is visible. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Ivano Trigiani, and we will talk about, apologies for the spoiler here, but we will talk about, first of all, the movements that can be triggered by subliminal stimuli. So talking about stimuli that cannot be perceived consciously. According to what we saw, those stimuli are processed differently. So subliminal stimuli and consciously perceived stimuli are processed differently. Basically, the starting point of this speech is the fact that probably the inclination to respond to an unperceived stimulus might depend on the state of the brain. We will try also to provide a kind of physiological model talking about the role that maybe the precuneus can have in this game. I started using this experiment by Warburg et al. This is a well-known experiment. This was aimed at investigating the effect of a masking effect in terms of performance and accuracy of reaction time as a function of the stimulus onset asynchrony. If you're not familiar with this concept, well, I'll try to explain briefly. The stimulus onset asynchrony is the time between the comparison of the first stimulus on the screen and the second stimulus on the screen. Another concept is the interstimulus interval, which is the time between from where the first stimulus disappeared from the screen to when the second stimulus appeared. According to the literature, the SOA is a better predictor of the performances, but also a better variable to study this effect. In this experiment, the main result is well depicted here. When there are two arrows on the screen, the first is masked by the second one. The effect here is called meta contrast. It means that the second arrow is surrounding physically on the screen the first one, masking it and keeping it basically invisible. And the main effect here was that when the two arrows were congruent, S1, the first stimulus, was priming the reaction time to the second stimulus, to S2. Conversely, when they were incongruent, the first arrow was creating a sort of hesitation in the brain, delaying the reaction time. Of course, we needed a minimum of SOA and a minimum ISI to have this effect, because when they were basically attached in time, the effect was basically invisible. We asked a simple question here, and it is basically, what happens if you move right in this situation? So if you're moving according to the first stimulus, because this experiment, of course, was considering only the valid answers, so the response to the second arrow. So this is my task that I used for the first experiment. This is a first experiment, and we will start, this is basically my starting point, because the consideration and the hypothesis that are analyzing here, they will start from the results of this first experiment. So I will try to avoid going too deeply into this experiment because it's very long and there are a lot of results. I will try just to take the gist of the experiment. Basically, it's very similar to the one that I just showed. I had to modify a few things. First of all, S1 sometimes can be absent, exactly like S2. We use the condition of S1 alone and S1 alone, S2 alone and S1 alone as a control. We were also recording the EEG to assess the event-related potentials. So it was very important, not only the control condition S1 and S2 alone, but also to maintain an interstimulus interval fixed for every subject to produce a grand average and do some statistics. Another trick that I used, I put the arrow differently from Warburg and colleagues on the same axis. So it's replacing basically the fixation dot, because I wanted to avoid eye movements that could have disturbed the event-related potentials. So the subject was forced in this kind of experiment to answer in a very narrow time window that was about 250 milliseconds, because after S2 disappeared, when basically we considered valid the response, before 200 milliseconds, basically it can be considered a fasting guess, so it wasn't valid. And then we showed a prohibition sign on the screen. It was always present, so it's not a sign of error. It's just a sign that we are not recording the response anymore. So the subject was forced to answer before the comparison of the stimulus. Why? Well, basically, in this way, we managed to create 4 randomized conditions. The 4 randomized conditions are, we saw already S1 alone and S2 alone, but then the 2 arrows, of course, they could be congruent or incongruent. But in the case of the incongruent condition, thanks to this prohibition sign, the subject sometimes was responding to S1 and sometimes to S2. And so we subdivided this condition into extra conditions to study what was going on. And this will be the main part of this discussion. So again, about the prohibition sign, it was basically creating this kind of confusion, but we didn't give the time to the brain to process this confusion, because the answer, well, the answer was very fast. And to us, motor response to S1 was even more interesting than the response to S2, because basically the response to S1 is not really well studied in literature. We have a lot of behavioral results, but I will try just to focus on the most important here. The accuracy, first of all, was used just to assess that the task was well done. Technically, the accuracy was always above 80% in the clear situation, S1 alone, S2 alone, or when the 2 arrows were congruent. but it's also better than this one because the experiment was very long and stressful. So sometimes the subject was avoiding answering because was trying to rest, or maybe he wanted to avoid to press randomly, so he missed a few answers. So the real accuracy was even better probably than this one. But we were very strict because well, in the congruent condition, we couldn't have any kind of control. So we had to rely on the other condition to understand if the subject was reliable or not, if it was a good subject responding in a good way. So here, the first result, very interesting, is the fact that the incongruent to S1 was even faster than S1 alone. At the beginning, we thought it was a mistake, but then we analyzed also the distribution of the responses. This is the distribution to the congruent condition, it's kind of Gaussian, while the incongruent condition that we subdivided in two parts, well, there is a skewness because probably, this is our interpretation, we grouped basically, this is just one condition, but we grouped basically S1, that was basically the condition when the subject was faster than a certain point, because after some hesitation, this will turn automatically into incongruent to S2, because basically, probably at that point, the brain was aware of the second stimulus and was pressing according to that stimulus. So this is not a mistake, it's not an error, it's a result, and I think it's a very beautiful result. So at this point, we asked ourselves a very simple question: why participant sometimes is responding to S1 and sometimes is responding to S2? Well, we have to consider here the processing, no? So basically, the whole structure of the visual system that contribute to the masking effect, well, it's complex. So we have to consider that the information is traveling a lot, and it's very difficult to determine when the awareness is occurring, the awareness of the stimulus, the perception of the stimulus. So for sure, this is an answer that I can say immediately we cannot say. But after a few considerations, maybe we can try to disentangle a few problems in this sense. First of all, sorry, one thing that I want to say, we are pretty sure that in the incongruent situation, whatever was the motor output, the brain saw S1, because in the comparisons that we did, S1 is processed because the event-related potentials that are due to the presence of S1 are basically the same in every condition when S1 was present. So the eyes saw S1, the brain saw S1. The awareness, no, but I would be cautious in this sense. And to try to determine why the subject was responding someone to S1 and sometimes to S2, we started analyzing this important concept that was developed in the 90s by Goodale and Milner. Basically, it seems that there are two pathways for the elaboration of visual information. And one is faster. The dorsal one is also, someone is calling it the wear path. And the other one, the ventral, is maybe slower and is about more the elaboration of the characteristics of objects. In our results, those are our event-related potentials, we started following the elaboration of the information from the occipital lobe. Every time I'm talking about lobes, I'm talking at electrode level. This is analysis done on the electrodes. So supposedly, basically, we are considering the elaboration in that kind of lobe, but of course the electrode is recording the activity of the whole brain. But we hope that the predominant activity that we recorded was in the area underneath the electrode. At occipital level, you can see underneath the graph, there is a bar. this is totally white. It means that there is no statistical significance here. So basically, to us, the elaboration done here, this is the average between O1 and O2, there are two occipital electrodes, is basically the same. We don't have any difference. The few differences that we can have visually, well, can be volume conduction or can be random variability. At parietal lobe, and I'm talking about the electrode PZ, that is more correct, we saw a very important difference. So according to our interpretation, and again, this is the interpretation of the old results and is still a starting point, this is the incongruent to S1, the black line, the red line is congruent to S2. Incongruent to S1, the elaboration was faster at a peak that came earlier, and then like a little bit lower. Very different is here the response to incongruent to S2. And we attributed this elaboration to the dorsal pathway, the one that activated immediately the motor cortex, and this one, the second one, to the ventral pathway. According to Milner, there is the possibility that the dorsal pathway is not accessible to consciousness. So we have proposed that the visual products of dorsal stream processing are not available to conscious awareness, and that they exist only as evanescent raw material to provide to unconscious moment-to-moment sensory calibration of our movements. This is a very fascinating sentence. Of course, again, we have to be conscious in our interpretation. So here, our hypothesis, we try to give an answer, to provide an answer to that question, why the subject is responding sometimes to S1 and sometimes to S2. Well, the hypothesis is that probably the choice depends, or it is influenced or modulated in some way from a probabilistic point of view by the state of the brain that was there when the stimulus was processed. To better understand what we mean with the state of the brain, we try to think about the dominant rhythm at rest. No? In the moment when the stimulus arrived, the brain is supposedly at rest, is waiting for something, but the dominant rhythm, of course, is the alpha rhythm. So the inhibition timing hypothesis by Wolfgang Klimesch provided this very fascinating idea. Classically, the alpha rhythm is seen like an inhibitory rhythm. So it provides inhibition, an inhibition that is fundamental to activate specific function. Here, Klimesch is giving us a more detailed model of this inhibition. It's not just inhibition, but is a precise and accurate inhibition that can give us a specific timing to access higher functions. This is the example, no? If we have two different levels of excitation for cells, if the alpha is very small, we cannot provide any kind of inhibition. So the two cells are working normally. When the alpha starts to be higher, it can turn on and off those cells, and basically is providing this kind of timing. If the alpha is too big, conversely, is basically turning off everything, and basically the firing pattern is just off. Well, this reminds me the clock of a computer. This is an old 8086. Well, maybe this kind of metaphor is abused when we are talking about the brain, but I like the idea that in a computer we need to wait the end of a cycle of the clock to start a new operation. But while the clock is basically fixed for a computer, the alpha rhythm has not only the phase, but also the power. There are a few examples I want just to provide here. This is a classic paradigm where basically we are studying, they were studying, the authors were studying the attentional blinks. And basically the idea here is that is it possible to predict the possibility of missing a stimulus according to where the phase, according to phase of the alpha rhythm, when basically in corresponds to the trigger, when basically the stimulus was presented. An important concept introduced here is that they were studying also the event-related potentials that due to the elaboration of the stimulus. And according to them here, they were trying to predict the shape of the event-related potentials according to the phase and the power of the alpha pre-stimulus, because a lot of authors agreed on the fact that the alpha rhythm, phase and power are contributing to the formation of the earlier event-related potentials, like P1, for example. Another very interesting example is the one of the flash. There are two flashes presented on the screen, but they can be seen like a simultaneous flash, just one flash, according to the phase of the alpha when the stimulus starts. So they can be simultaneous, or if in this case we have a low phase and the two flashes are perceived like simultaneous, like one single stimulus. And no, sorry, those are different flashes that are perceived like at the same, like appearing at the same time, but they are delayed. Sorry, that's the real interpretation. While instead the alpha is in the high phase, the two different flashes are perceived like sequential, or even like a flash that is moving in time. Again, with the flashes, this is another important result. They can perceive just like one single flash or two different flashes according to the speed, to the frequency of the alpha. If the alpha has a higher frequency, we know that alpha is not fixed, it's around 10 Hertz, but according to, well, some people can have a faster alpha. If the alpha was faster, they could see two flashes. If when the alpha was slow, they could see just one flash. And in literature, we have a lot of studies about the phase and the power of alpha pre-stimulus. And of course, well, here we are not claiming that we are the first, and of course there are a lot of studies about that. But here we are trying to propose something a little bit different. As we can see, people are talking about the fact that a reduced alpha rhythm that can predict perceptual suppression, but also, and this is very beautiful, that the pre-stimulus alpha power can end the phase maybe are originated by different neural sources, and they have a distinct impact on the stimulus-evoked responses. For example, the pre-stimulus alpha can predict inattentional blindness, and this is very recent. This is a study about the fact that the pre-stimulus activity at some point interacts with the evoked recurrent processing to facilitate conscious visual perception. What we want to add to the literature? Well, first of all, let's talk about the power. We know very well that those results sometimes they can appear like in contrast. My idea is that every experiment is different, and we need to analyze exactly the task, because that can make the difference. For example, here, this is, I went very simple here because I wanted to be clear about what I was seeing. I analyzed the power spectral density of the brain 1 second before the stimulus for an entire second. And statistically, I found that basically the power of the alpha was higher in the incongruent to S2 condition with respect to incongruent to S1 condition, only at parietal level. Again, I'm talking about electrodes. So over the activity recorded in the PZ electrode, this electrode here. From a classical interpretation, inhibitional, if the alpha is higher, this alpha is inhibiting the processing of the invisible stimulus, of the subliminal stimulus, the small arrow S1. But if we want to check also the phase, well, again, I don't know when the stimulus is processed, when the awareness is occurring, where is the quality of the awareness of the stimulus. So I try to see at 0 milliseconds when the stimulus was delivered, what was going on. And those are basically the differences in phase between incongruent to S1 and incongruent to S2. And the only difference that I saw is very small, but still significant, was again over PZ. And this is a small difference in phase. The other one is basically similar. It's very difficult to find a difference in phase because, of course, the alpha is distributed randomly in the experiment. So we hoped that this division between incongruent to S1 and incongruent to S2 could have produced some difference, and we found it. So this is the theory, the hypothesis, no? The railroad switcher. I'm thinking that at parietal level, probably, there is a railroad switcher that it depends on the state of the brain that is deciding if the information is processed dorsally or ventrally. If it's parietal or not, well, this is difficult, but again, we saw our statistical differences only over the PZ electrode, so everything is pointing there. Also, our results, the previous results that we saw about the elaboration of the incongruent to S1 stimulus, everything was pointing at a parietal difference. So if we want to try to provide a physiological model, well, I found this beautiful paper that is showing that basically this is a new interpretation of the precuneus that is not only now considered as a hub for the default mode network, no? So something that is a main character in the resting state, but also it can have a very active function when we want to update the external information with respect to the state of the brain. In this case, of course, I'm considering, and this is difficult, that the first stimulus, S1, the small arrow pointing left or right, in 50 milliseconds, already established a state of the brain. No? So the brain was set on left, for example, or right. And then this comparator is updating the information in a different way according to information provided by S2. Well, of course, this is an hypothesis. But I have another, and this is the last result, just to stress a little bit about the PZ activity and the parietal activity. This is the congruent condition, that condition that we didn't talk a lot about the congruent condition because it looked like pretty straightforward. But we try to do something. This is a qualitative analysis, of course, but there's also statistics that prove what I'm saying. Basically, this is the congruent condition, the blue one. And we try to subtract the activity due to S1 alone and to S2 alone. And this was very incredible. And this happens only over PZ, again, and only in the congruent condition. When we subtract the activity due to S1, we don't have anything more, basically. This is just variance. And there's just a very, very small oscillation. So it seems that basically the activity due to congruent and to S1 alone are the same. So when the subject is participating to is trying to decide what to do in the congruent condition, his brain elaborated S1, even if it was invisible, and he didn't perceive the presence of S1, but his brain is processing S1. And when basically S2 appears, he's ignoring S2 because he already decided what to do, and he's already ready to press the button in that direction. So this is another result that is pointing to the fact that everything can be played at parietal level. My conclusions but Nick can be more accurate on this, providing a philosophical interpretation of this, is that the state of the brain can, in some way, modulate whether a subliminal stimulus will be processed or not. So the response, this is another important question, no? Is the awareness playing a causal role in movements? Well, it seems that the answer could be roughly no, in the sense that the response does not need awareness here. At least we are talking about the awareness of that stimulus, not talking in general of the awareness of consciousness, of course. And so in some way, it's kind of random. Of course, I have I'm totally grateful to people who work with me on the experiment, Dr. Mark Hallett and Kaya Shiman, and then my buddy for this adventure, Nick. Thank you very much, Nick. And of course, thank you very much to Walter and Diad for the precious suggestions and for the organization. This is where I stop my talk, and I'm ready to let Nick take the word.
Nick, before you start, let me just remind everyone that you can enter questions because we will have time for questions afterwards. I think the best way is to go to the Q&A function. Is that right, Uri? Is that the Liad? Yes?
Yeah, I think that would be the best way, just to
Good.
put
So
the
please
Q&A.
enter questions in the Q&A, and then they will answer them after Nick gives his presentation. Take it away, Nick.
All right. So thanks for the talk, Ivano. And it was actually quite fun to discuss back and forth with Ivano about, the methods and the results and kind of getting into the logic of the argument. And I want to actually dive a bit deeper into the logic of the argument and see how we could, reveal how they have implications for various views of free will and what free will might or might not depend on. And I'm going to take a position about one of the arguments, but I'll pose a question to the scientists as well as a question to the philosophers. But you might think that one of the overarching questions is this: can unreflectively determined button presses be free? So with some help from Ivano, I was actually able to kind of map out the empirical argument that is made throughout the talk you just heard with the slides you were shown. And I was able to map it. This is something I find that I basically need to do to make sure I understand what I'm about to get into. Obviously, this map is not necessarily conducive to slides. The text is small and things like that. So I'm actually going to go through each part of the argument. The point is just to say that when mapped out, it actually does become a fairly coherent argument that has, the kind of structure that philosophers would like. So I want to take us back to this experience of swiping left and swiping right on our favorite smartphone app, or if you prefer the experiment that Ivano laid out, you can do that. So in this particular case, you would not necessarily be keeping track of time as in some maybe famous Liebig case experiments where you're looking at a clock, but you are consciously and deliberately deciding what to do. And you're doing it pretty rapidly, 250 millisecond response time is pretty quick. And what you're deciding is whether to swipe right or left based on whatever you're seeing on the screen. So, if we carry out the thought experiment the way that we just heard about, you would also be doing this while neuroscientists like Ivano at the National Institute of Health are recording your brain activity. And, these neuroscientists are pretty smart. And so what they realize, as Ivano pointed out, is that in one of the conditions, this incongruent condition where there's a mask of an arrow that shows up almost immediately after the first arrow shows up, that mask produces some interesting results that you don't seem to observe when that arrow is in the same direction as the first arrow in the congruent conditions, or when maybe there isn't a mask. And so what they observed is that some people press the S1 and other people press the S2 button. And curiously, the people who press S2 seem to like take longer to do it, or there seems to be some sort of divergence or difference in the reaction time in this incongruent condition, such that you could basically sort the behavioral outcomes the way that they have been here. So as Ivano pointed out, and I'm just going to review real quickly, it doesn't just seem to be like a mere visual effect. And so the way the logic goes is like, look, if this were a visual effect, then we would observe the kinds of differences that we observed in the parietal area in the occipital areas, and we don't, right? So we have these black bars indicating significant difference on the parietal on the right, but we don't have corresponding bars or really any bars indicating difference in the occipital areas on the left. And so if you accept that if then, proposition, then it would seem that this would rule out the possibility of a mere visual difference. And so, that's what pushes us down the path of looking for other explanations of what's going on here. So one thing you might think is you might return to this realization that the faster responses looked different than the slower responses. Or another way to put that is the people who pressed one button did it faster than the people who pressed the other button. And you might think that perhaps the faster responses are processed in a different path than the slower responses, which is the explanation we were offered. And recall that almost half of the participants didn't even see the first arrow, and another roughly half said they perceived something, but they had no clue what it was. So there's a lot of not fully perceiving the stimuli or the mask, and that could become relevant to this explanation that Ivano's offering. So the idea could be that, look, faster decisions can be processed pre-consciously or non-consciously, or it might be the other way around. Things that are processed non-consciously or pre-consciously can be faster. But, processing that occurs more consciously might take more time. And I guess I'm, positing that from the armchair. And there seems to be some evidence that Ivano, I think, helpfully laid out for us that the dorsal path might be a path by which pre-conscious processing could happen. So this sort of like invisible stimuli could be processed that way. And the ventral path might be a path where things get processed more consciously. And so the story would be the difference between the response times and the button presses and the incongruent mask condition are consistent with these two processing paths. Perhaps the faster S1 button presses were processed dorsally, and the slower S2 button presses were processed ventrally. Okay, so then we might want to ask, well, what determines which path this takes, right? So Ivano helped lay this out, and I'm still just reviewing. So suppose we knew what determines whether the dorsal or ventral pathway was used, and therefore which button was pressed. This is where we can begin asking questions that philosophers are probably going to want some answers to. So you might want to know, is this process of determination random? That is to say, it's unpredictable, or it's perhaps uncontrollable, or you might have some other notion of random you'd want to put on the table here. And is this process conscious, right? So suppose we accept the alpha state when this processing occurs, and that somehow determines the path. Is that random or predictable or controllable, or is that conscious? But suppose you think there's some other mechanism. You could just ask these same questions about that, right? So I'm not necessarily saying we need to commit to any particular explanation of what determines the path. I'm just asking particular questions about the path determination, whatever that mechanism or process is. And the reason is because these questions about the determination of the button presses and the consciousness thereof and the paths upon which they were processed is going to be relevant to some people's views about the implications for free will, even if each of these questions is orthogonal to the other, right? So it might not be that an answer to one question determines your answers to all the others. You might be able to kind of pick and choose different answers to each of these questions. So getting to where this kind of can be mapped onto some existing views and where I might begin to start taking a position. For some views of free will seems to depend on the claim that freedom requires conscious control. And I actually want to reflect on this a bit. This is the thing I alluded to in the beginning of the talk when I said I used to have a certain view on this, and I think I've realized I was making an error. So to get to that, I want to just lay out a super simple argument about why unconscious decisions would not be free. You could add in details or, maybe modify words slightly, but the structure would be roughly this. I'm not consciously aware of my intentions, or maybe you would say decisions, as or before they form. If I'm not consciously aware of intentions or decisions as or before they form, then whatever actions result from the intentions aren't free. Therefore, my intentional actions aren't free. So I think some people will find these premises intuitively plausible. If you thought about them a lot, then you might have like a list in your mind now of where you would want to diverge from this argument, or what you think the problems are. And I'm just going to grant this sort of hidden premise that neuroscientists have actually identified things like intentions or decisions with their measurements, right? Whether it's an ERP or some other signal that they get from their measurements. But what I want to reflect on is this second premise, and I'll call it here the free will skeptic's implication. But the idea is that somehow freedom or free will depends on when and how we become conscious of some of our own processing. And I used to basically think this seems right, but at some point in grad school, I thought, actually, I think my reasoning for accepting premise 2 might actually be based on magical thinking. So this is where I'm going to kind of unpack my journey about this premise and kind of give you some of the reasons for why I've changed my mind. And then I'll jump into 2 other questions we could ask about what determines the button presses. So when we're considering these Libet style experiments where, people are pressing buttons and we're trying to figure out what processes led to that button pressing, we're usually asking like when a researcher can detect our intention before we do. So there's kind of this third personal lens. And I guess you could also add, it's the third personal lens on our proximal decisions, right? The neuroscientists aren't predicting what we're going to do next week. They're trying to detect what's going to happen, moments from now. And it seems to me that this third personal prediction of our proximal intentions or decisions may be crucial to people's intuition that we lack free will. So there's some arguments by Fishburne and some evidence from Namias et al. Suggesting that when you frame questions like this, like a neuroscientist is predicting a proximal decision, people's intuitions about free will are different than if you frame it slightly differently. If it's not a neuroscientist, but a psychologist, or you can tweak the vignette in various ways to get people to change. But I think a third personal framing might be part of what drives people's intuitions here. And so one thing I started asking myself is, wait a minute, let me think about this first personally. How might my intuition change if I'm not asking about what scientists should think, but focusing on my own perspective? When should I become aware of my own intention? Should it happen? Should I become aware of it before the intention forms, as soon as it forms, after it forms? And when I reframe the question to be more first personal, I find that my initial free will skeptic intuition sort of flips. So I become much less concerned about the fact that I may be aware of my intentions only after they form. And in case it's not entirely clear why the new frame kind of changes my intuition, I'm going to try to explain it here. So we agree that our mental activity corresponds to brain activity. If we deny that, then we're basically denying the motivation for all of the science we just sat through. So when I form an intention, my brain is doing something. And then when I become aware of my intention, presumably my brain is doing another thing. And so just as our intentions precede our awareness thereof, the brain activities corresponding to our intentions precede the brain activities corresponding to our awareness of the intentions. This seems like only natural and totally uncontroversial, to me at least. So the neural correlates of my intentions must precede my awareness of the intentions, and therefore the neural correlates of that awareness. And so my awareness cannot precede its corresponding brain activity. To suggest otherwise would be to reject the correspondence between mental activity and brain activity that motivates the studies, as I just said. So when I reframe the Libet studies in terms of my ability to detect my own intentions, free will just doesn't seem threatened. I'm not even surprised by results like these anymore. It seems utterly unsurprising that my awareness of my intentions occurs after my intention formation, and therefore after the corresponding brain activity of that intention formation. And so I think about the causation, when I think about the causation involved, becoming aware of the intention seems like it must be causally downstream of, among other things, the existence of the intention. And so intention forming activity just has to occur at a different time than my awareness of the intention formation, namely before. And I just can't figure out how I could have rationally expected otherwise prior to thinking about this reframing. So, now I'm in a position where I had these two intuitions. I seem to have changed my mind, and I'm asking myself, so which intuition is better? My prior intuition that unreflective intentions seem to conflict with my sense of free will, or my new intuition? Sorry, I meant to say prior intuition and new intuition. So I'm comparing my prior intuition to my new intuition that unreflective intentions are pretty unsurprising and seemingly compatible with my notion of free will. So one unforgivable problem with my prior intuition is that it seemed to imply some sort of magical thinking. My prior intuition involved a notion of free will, according to which I could become aware of my intention before or perhaps as soon as it exists. And that would seem to require magic based on, I don't know, maybe a few premises about how causation works and, the order that causation must occur. So this is how and why I changed my mind on this. But there's other things to talk about here. So it turns out that maybe the folk also don't seem to think that conscious deliberation is the most important thing when it comes to determining whether certain decisions are free. So here, lay people attributed high levels of free will, freedom, and control to both arbitrary and deliberate decisions. But what seemed to make more of a difference to people's understanding of freedom or other aspects of decisions was how difficult the decisions were. It's always difficult, or I guess nerve-wracking, to talk about a paper when one of the authors is on the call. So people thought there was more freedom for easier than for harder decisions when there wasn't a clear superior option, but they thought there was less freedom for an easy decision when there was one clear superior option, perhaps not unlike some of the button press tasks that we see in the neuroscience of free will literature. Even so, the degree to which free will was assigned in most of these different situations was relatively high, around 6 out of 7 on the scale. And so the differences in the free will ratings didn't seem to be about whether the decision was deliberate versus more abstract. It seemed to be more about whether the decision was easy versus hard. And so I'm kind of wondering if this means that in order to get evidence that would impact people's view of free will, we might need to be using tasks that ordinary people see as more challenging or more hard as opposed to easy button pressing tasks. Otherwise, we might be studying tasks that ordinary people never thought were free to begin with. And so when we tell them that neuroscientists can predict it in ways that are supposed to be surprising, they might say, well, I'm not sure I would have thought that was free before you gave me this neuroscience information. However, I would imagine that as a scientist, it's difficult to, do certain changes to the tasks that you use in your experiments, right? So if you try to make a task very, very difficult, that might introduce all sorts of noise or other issues that make it difficult to detect whatever you would need to detect to test the kinds of hypotheses you're interested in. And so one thing I find myself wondering is, even if we in some sense need to be using more difficult, deliberate decisions in this neuroscience of button pressing, I'm not sure how feasible that is. And so one of my questions to the scientists in the room would be, how feasible is that? And what alternatives are there, so to speak, to the so-called swiping left versus swiping right, and whatever the alternative might be in terms of a harder task. So one other thing that you might think is relevant to views of free will is how they're determined, right? So your view of freedom of the decisions in these studies might depend on whether you think that determined decisions or intentions can't be free, or whether they can be. And you might also want to drill down a bit and say, well, it depends on whether they're always determined or how determined, right? So if they're only determined in 99% of cases, perhaps for some people that's enough to say, well, there's still room for freedom, so to speak. Or perhaps you might point out, well, they're determined probabilistically or something like that. Like, 60% of the time they go the way that the neuroscientists predict, but that leaves, mathematically 40% for, I don't know, whatever their notion of free will is to have an impact on the decision. And so I guess one question I'm wondering for the compatibilists and incompatibilists of various stripes in the room is like, what are you thinking about the determination of these button presses, whether it's determined by alpha amplitude brain states as Ivano had in mind, or something else if you have another hypothesis in your mind? And what would you think about that threatening some notion of free will, whether it's an incompatibilist notion of free will or another? So just to kind of recap the questions that I was asking throughout my section of the talk, does lack of conscious awareness of proximal intentions and decisions still undermine your sense of free will when you reframe things? First, personally, does that seem to matter to you the way it did to me? And then should we study more difficult tasks in this kind of neuroscience? And, maybe more importantly, is that even feasible? 3, were the button presses determined, whether by alpha amplitude or something else? And if so, what would that mean for whatever notion of free will you think we should care about? So thank you to Ivano and the organizers for the time, and I guess I can end here.
Leon, am I supposed to lead the discussion? I can do that.
And we can do it together. I think the idea was for us to ask the first questions and then open it for others, but I'm happy to do whatever.
Okay, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Okay, so I wanted to ask a more general question, Ivano, with respect to the differentiation you're making between ventral and dorsal activity. And this is indeed a well-established dissociation for the two visual streams hypothesis, but it relates to somewhat different notions, I think, of conscious and unconscious processing, with motor activations versus visual ones, or maybe a more accurate way to frame it would be, action related versus perceptually related. And typically when we talk about these types of experiments, I think the assumption is that the information goes through the ventral stream. If it's conscious, then there will be feedback. If it's unconscious, there will be feed forward, but not necessarily this differentiation between dorsal and ventral. So I wanted to ask, how do you tie these two somewhat different accounts with your data?
Thank you very much. I have to say that I totally agree. Well, first of all, I never thought that the two pathways are totally separated, though I'm pretty sure that, well, the brain is always very active, so probably there is some kind of influence between them. But one point that you just raised is something that I didn't say before, because the model can be a little bit complicated, but I like the idea that the railroad switcher can block or modify a little bit one of those feedback that you were talking about. That was one of the ideas that I had. Absolutely. So going back, because, for example, the separation seems in the graph that we can see also in the books or in the papers, the separation starts at the occipital level, no? But I found something that is different only at parietal level. So is it possible that it's exactly one of those feedback? For example, if we think about recurrent processing theory, no, Victor Lemme divided the information processing in 4 steps, no? And the first 2 steps were like a shallow feed forward, then a deep feed forward, and then there is a feedback, the localized recurrent processing, that was going back. And according to him, he could find scattered consciousness at that level. Well, I will disagree probably to the consciousness at sensory level, but I didn't want to go into that kind of discussion because it can be too complicated. But if there is that passage, maybe the railroad switcher is acting at that level, influencing the feedback that you were talking about. So absolutely, I think that is compatible. This idea is compatible with what you were saying. I don't know if I answered.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Nick, just maybe a general question about something that I'm struggling with as well, like the meaning of these studies in general to the concept of free will, in the sense that all the studies that we do involve some form of operationalization. But here I often wonder if the translation that we make from the philosophical concept to the theoretical one, psychological one, and at the end of the day, to a right versus left key button press, does it really mean anything? Or is the distance between the theoretical construct and the operational definition in the experiment simply too wide in order to draw conclusions from one to the other?
Yeah, I like this question. It gets at part of my motivation for sort of diverging from the type of task, or like, playing with the type of task that Ivana was using to introduce the type of swiping we do on our smartphone, right? Because some of the swiping we do on our smartphone seems to be relatively low stakes in the way that maybe button pressing is in an experiment, right? So when I'm triaging my emails on the train in the morning, I'm swiping, or maybe I'm marking things on red, and a lot of those emails just don't matter to me, or I just don't want them to, to deal with them, right? So they're like not that important. But that seems like, I've heard there are apps where swiping can be much more high stakes. And so I was trying to get at what those decisions might involve in terms of like how much they matter and how much people care about them. The nice thing about those decisions is, at least, I don't know, the way people talk about them is they do seem to also happen relatively quickly, the swiping decisions. So I'm thinking of like these dating apps, right? So it seems like there's talk of how these swipes happen relatively quickly based on information that you see, but super high stakes, especially depending on which kind of app you're dealing with, right? There's more implications about swipes in some apps than in others. And so I take the point about like maybe a substantial gap between what we're doing in labs and what we're doing in thought experiments, or in, I don't know, toy examples about decisions in philosophy. But I do wonder if there's a way to at least get closer to that. And that's kind of the question I'm asking. Like, I'm genuinely unsure as someone who's not very skilled in this kind of science, what can actually be done to bridge the gap, if it can be done at all.
Good. So I think it's my turn now. I don't know what happened to Liad. She left. Liad
had an audio problem. She's back now.
Oh, now she's back.
Sorry.
No problem.
Such an interesting reply. I'm so sorry. I'll watch the recording to see what I've missed.
My turn to ask a question, and I want to ask a question, two questions really of both of you. But I want to insist on a distinction between the problem of determination or determinism and the problem of consciousness. Because you could say, yeah, I consciously choose my actions, but they are determined or they're not determined. And you could say they're unconscious influences on my action, and they determine my action or they don't determine my action. So the question of consciousness and the question of determinism are two separate, independent issues. So I have a question about each. With regard to determinism, I really want to ask Ivana to respond to Nick's point. Like, so you could have these alpha states. Does your evidence show that they determine the choice, or that they increase the probability a little bit, but still leave a lot of room for control, even if not complete control? And then with regard to consciousness, I want to ask, so there are unconscious influences in these highly artificial lab situations. Is the claim that these experiments are supposed to show that there are always unconscious influences? and what kind of degree of influence? Because oftentimes you might incline some way, but then stop yourself because you have enough time. But when you've only got 250 milliseconds, you don't do that. And so I want to know whether we can generalize from these experiments to a problem, to the problem of consciousness and the role in our actions in general.
Okay. From my point of view, I will say, probably cowardly, that it's always a matter of probability, but it's never to. Well, I think that this can be also seen by the fact that if we separate every trial in our experiments, we will never see something that is very, very neat and clear and determined. So it's always a matter of probability, no? If we do an analysis with the rock curves, for example, we will see something perfectly defined, no? An area of 1, and everything will be super, super clear. So we never saw something like that. We are always trying to do some statistics. So for sure, I think it's a matter of probability. That was what I was saying, that when Liad observed the fact that is it possible that maybe there is an influence between the two pathways, and maybe a feedback that in some way can modulate this probability. In this sense, this is my vision from.
Okay, so that's the question about determinism. What about consciousness? Can you generalize to, to say that we never have conscious control over that?
Well, now I'm really scared, but to answer. But I think that it's very important to take into account the nature of the experiment. So this is a precise experiment about the unseen stimulus, and this I read the comment by Aaron, so maybe we can also talk about that later. But yes, an unseen stimulus, unperceived stimulus, if we want. And in this case, we can talk about consciousness of the stimulus. So perception, again, it's a matter of definition. And I will never dare to generalize this, but I think that if we are talking about the consciousness of the stimulus, well, yes, I will say that at least for that small little arrow, we can lose consciousness of that little arrow, but still we can act according to it. I don't know if I answered.
No, so my question was, yes, you can. But what does that show you about actions in general in the world, in the kind of everyday life where there's not such time pressure, and at least there are no known unconscious influences of the same sort, although there are lots of experiments suggesting that they're all around us. Does this only show lack of freedom in this particular setting? How far can you generalize?
I think that in our real life, normally we are surrounded by a number of this kind of unseen stimuli, and I think that they can influence our life every day, in every moment. Some of them are totally irrelevant, probably, but are they restricting our consciousness? Is it possible? I think this is possible, because if this effect can occur in every moment of our lives, and I think that each of us experience something like that, a kind of loss of consciousness related to very small details of our lives. So is it possible? Yes, I think it can be generalized.
I think this touches upon exactly the same question that I also asked Nick before. I think this is maybe the crux of the matter, in the way our ability to extend from these findings to the phenomenon that we are interested in. I see that we already have some questions from the people, so maybe from the crowd, so maybe we should move to those as well.
I agree, but first let's see if Nick has a response to.
Sure.
I don't know if he wanted to say anything, and then we can go.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think I have much to contribute on that particular point right now.
Okay. Who should, I mean, I see two hands. Aaron was actually the earliest of all. But if Pills is just a finger on this point, is it a follow-up or is it a new?
Mine would be just a clarification on the experiment, but I
Okay, well, then let's go to Aaron and then back to you. And then we have one from the crowd as well, Polaris. Yeah.
So I have a comment following just the discussion we were just having. I also have the couple of questions that I wrote, so I'll leave those written. But I think there might be a confusion here in talking about S1 as being unconscious. And I would assert that S1, it's not quite correct to call it unconscious. I'll assert that it was conscious, because it would have been seen had S1 not appeared. So it's not a question of conscious or unconscious, but it's a question of what you were conscious of. S1 was replaced in consciousness by S2. Which is the nature of masking, but the confusion comes with the fact that S1 was visible. It was not invisible. It's just that it was replaced immediately by something that happened very soon after it because of this phenomenon of masking. But if it had been presented by itself, and in fact, when it was presented by itself, it was seen. It was conscious. Even in DeHaan's taxonomy, where you have pre-conscious versus subliminal versus conscious, it doesn't fit into any one of those categories nicely.
So maybe, Ivana, if I may, before you reply, just to clarify, Aaron, your question and your distinction. So you differentiate between visible and invisible as things that can, in principle, be seen or not be seen?
Now I feel
Right.
bad because maybe I used the wrong. Sometimes I'm trying to use synonyms, but they are not synonyms because I'm saying different things. And Aaron is perfectly right. I meant a stimulus that is unseen or in some way is unprocessed or processed differently. I didn't mean invisible because, as I said, we know for sure that it was processed by the brain because we see the P1, for example. This is a clear evidence that S1 was processed, and for sure it was processed. So I agree absolutely. And I think that an invisible stimulus, so an invisible that is not totally processed by the brain at all, no, it won't trigger anything to me. So
Well, not invisible. Obviously, if it was not processed at all by the brain,
Yeah.
then for sure it can. But I would say a stimulus that was processed by the brain in such a way that it was never conscious, also, even processed by the brain, would not trigger a stimulus. In other words, if there's no event, if there's no conscious event, then I would submit that there's no response.
I think that we cannot answer this if we are not embracing a specific theory, big theory about consciousness, because in my idea, again, taking some kind of reference from technology, I imagine that our working memory is a buffer, and we have S1 and S2. So yes, S2 is replacing S1, but you are saying that it's replacing S1 in consciousness. I don't know. I mean, if it's just in this buffer that maybe is processed consciously later, that was my principal idea. Maybe it's this buffer that is processed later. And if S1 survived, it will just trigger a mistake. What we saw, I didn't show this result, but we see the error-related negativity in response to S1 in the incongruent condition. Otherwise, it will be coherent with S2 because S2 replaced S1, the subject responded to S1, everything is coherent, and consciousness of the stimulus that comes later will agree with the action. That's media, but I'm not able to say and to distinguish if this process at that level, like at sensory level, is already conscious or not, because I should embrace probably some kind of sensory level theory, like the recurrent processing theory, for example. But
if I may, I'm sorry that I'm pushing on this because I think it's a very interesting question and I'm not sure I fully understand. So Aaron, is your claim that participants consciously saw S1 and then
No.
So how do you mean what do you mean when you say that it was consciously registered? Or...
Right. So no, not at all. Absolutely not. They didn't. It was replaced by S2 in consciousness, and so it was never conscious. I'm just saying that it doesn't fit into any of these. It's not pre-conscious because preconscious implies that it is never consciously, it wouldn't have been seen even by itself. Like a preconscious stimulus, there's no mask, it doesn't matter, it's still not seen, right? It certainly wasn't subliminal, because if presented by itself, it would be seen. It wasn't conscious either, because it was replaced by S2, so it doesn't fit into any of those categories. But it would have, the main point is that you would have been conscious of it, and clearly were, when it was presented by itself. So I think, but let me, the main thing is this: there was an event, S1/S2. There was a conscious event on every trial. The big question is, can you trigger a movement when there's no conscious event ever at all, period? And I still, that has not been shown. I just want to clarify. That's the clarification I'm trying to make, right? Could you imagine sitting there and there's no conscious event, and you just press a button for who knows what reason, and you press it presumably for the right reason because there was a stimulus, but you don't know why. That has not been shown, right? And that's just, that's an important distinction.
Okay.
So I think it's Till's turn.
Thank you. Thanks. Very, very interesting. Two very interesting talks. I have a couple of, I think, well, maybe stupid question. Maybe I wasn't attentive enough, but that I'm not super clear about the experiment. And then maybe once I think I understand, maybe also a comment. But right. So the questions, the initial questions. Am I understanding this right, that subjects don't experience this as a decision? They just want to do the right thing, i.e. press the right button. If the arrow goes left, they press left. Yeah, so that, okay. Yes, okay, that's the first thing. Okay, great. So they're from the subject's point of view, there isn't a decision. Just there are two different arrows. Then secondly, when they, in the incongruent condition, when they press following S1, do they experience that as an error afterwards? Are there, so they will say, oh, oops, I made a mistake. Is that how it will?
I thank you, Thielman, for this clarification. It's important for everyone, I think, because we did a second separate session just to try to see if they were perceiving the idea of making a mistake. And they were saying exactly, oops, I did it wrong. And the brain waves, we didn't want to disturb the main experiment. That's why we used a separate session. Because if we were adding other things, the masking effect wasn't working because they were distracted. So yes, they had the impression of making a mistake. The event-related potentials confirmed that it was a mistake. Plus, in another session, we checked the visibility of the stimulus that was shown by Nick. No, then basically 90% of the cases, they say, no, I didn't see anything at all, or I saw something on the screen, I have no idea. Yes. Okay, great. That's what I thought. So third question on the experiment, and then maybe some thoughts. So the last question, I take it it's for technical reasons that you have the 250 milliseconds boundary. But suppose you didn't have it. Am I right in assuming that people would just go with S2? Because presumably people would not try to be as quick as possible.
Sorry, if we don't have what? Sorry, maybe
if you didn't have a time limit on reacting,
okay,
and people would try to get it right, presumably they just would take a little bit more time. Taking a little bit more time will mean that you won't get any S1 responses. You will only get S2 responses.
That was exactly what it happened during the pilot of our study. And we were struggling. I put the prohibition sign exactly to avoid this effect. And then it changed totally. At the beginning, I swear, I thought I will use this prohibition sign. And I thought, oh my God, this is the the stupidest idea I ever had in my life. Let's try it, because I was desperate. It wasn't working. And it worked. And I was like, oh, wow. So yeah, yes, absolutely. Okay. They will always process that too.
Okay, so great. So now maybe a few little comments. So I guess on the one hand, I guess this doesn't seem to suggest that we can't make any conscious decisions. I mean, as it looks like that there aren't really any conscious decisions here. What people are trying to do is they're trying to follow an instruction rather than making a decision. And if you give them enough time to follow that instruction, then they will successfully follow that instruction. So as soon as we are on the time scale on which we normally try to act according to conscious intentions, they perform at 100%. That's the result of your experiments. So the interesting thing is, if we're interested in very fast actions where people probably don't have very clear intuitions on whether they make a conscious decision or not. I mean, in this case, they're not even making a decision. They're just trying to do the right thing. Sometimes is there a right thing? According to what they see, sometimes they don't do the right thing. So the last question that is then, so I'm not sure I see any implications for free will if people just take a little bit of time to act according to their intentions. But an interesting question would be is there an influence on how people set themselves up in terms of whether or not, so is there preparation which would make it more likely that you go with S1 rather than with S2? I suppose if you want to be successful, what you want to do is to be slow enough that you see S2 because you think there is only S2, but not too slow so that you're not hit by the stop sign. So I suppose really this looks like it's a strategy game. You need to show self-knowledge so that you can be as slow as possible, so that you have a really high chance of getting the right answer, because you're not aware that there is something else that you could follow. Is that something that might be trainable as well? So I can try. The people who go really fast presumably are fools, because they will, according to their own intention, often do the wrong thing. It's the people who are good at understanding what the task is, who try to answer as slowly as possible and get as closely as possible to the stop sign, which will get the right answers. Is that roughly right?
Well, I think that this is very complex and we could talk for hours about that. It's very, very interesting. I will try to give a quick answer. First of all, I will steal something from Walter immediately. I'm pretty sure that Walter at this point will say, even if I'm forced to press left or right because this is the nature of the experiment and I have to be a good subject, it's still a decision. Right, Walter? Did I say it good?
Yeah, you can always refuse.
So it's still a decision, no? And then I think that in some way, this kind of experiment can simulate something that might happen in our real life every day, because again, we are always stimulated by this kind of very small stimuli, and we know for sure there are also accidents in life that are caused by a very quick decision, maybe triggered by a stimulus like this. So maybe is it possible to generalize again this kind of results? It's not my field, of course, but I'm pretty sure that, of course, this is an example very specific. But I don't think that it's so specific that it cannot be generalized at some level in real life. That's my impression, but of course.
So great. I think we should turn to a question for Nick. There's one by Polaris Coy in the Q&A, but I'm not sure. Can Polaris be made able to speak consciously, Tian? Uri?
I am. Can you hear me?
Good.
Great. So I was wondering about something that I think touches on what Walter asked about, and a little bit also on what Till asked about, namely the implications of all of this for free will. So I'm very much in agreement with the intuition that this timeline from recognizing that you've made a decision, you should have that recognition after making a decision. So maybe also making a slight distinction from the broader concept of consciousness there. So yeah, we'll need to have a preference before we can recognize, oh, I have a preference for this. But what does it mean in terms of free will? I couldn't somehow follow the argument there, because to me, it seems like that is something that's compatible with any of the free mainstream approaches to free will. So could you elaborate a little bit on your reasoning there?
Yeah, so it might just be worth trying to spell out the motivation for bringing it up. So, when I was approaching the task, I think I might have been approaching it a bit the way Tillman was, where I was thinking, why would someone think that these types of decisions aren't free? Because I guess I used to think that in a way, when I would think about the unconscious part of the decision. But I've changed my mind about that. And so I guess I'll explain why I've changed my mind, and then I'll, kind of search for the reasons why someone might think that they're not free in the sense that philosophers would care about. And that's why I started posing other questions besides just the consciousness aspect. And so, to be honest, I didn't find anything that made me think it was a strong candidate for thinking that these decisions shouldn't be free. The one thing I do wonder about, and Ivano alluded to this towards the beginning, I think I might have mentioned it as one of my questions in the introduction, and maybe like at the end, but I'm not sure it made it onto a slide, or at least my slides. And that is the possibility that like this railroad switch is just random. And I guess you're going to have to ask, well, what do you mean by random? But, unpredictable, uncontrollable, insert your own definition of random, and maybe give an analysis of each one or something. But on whatever definition of random you care about, like, could that matter? And that does seem to kind of at least give me pause about what to think about this. But still, I don't find myself fully persuaded to think that that's like a decisive factor in whether or not these decisions in these particular studies should or should not be considered free. So maybe I share your puzzlement.
Right. Yeah. I think part of the puzzlement really comes from, I take your intuition to be, there's nothing off about this sequence of events, right? This is exactly how human behavior should work out. But then, that does give rise to the kind of further question. Okay, so things are exactly as they should be. This is the regular state of affairs. So the regular state of affairs doesn't give us any reasons to think it's unfree, but why would it give us any reason to think that it is free? Like does that come from some intuition that determinism is somehow counterintuitive? So the state of affairs would have to strike us as counterintuitive to match the counterintuitiveness of determinism or something like that. But that obviously doesn't work out. Anyway, I wonder what you think about that.
Right. I guess then maybe this reveals that the notion of free will I'm thinking of, at least in this reframing that I mentioned, seems to be a fairly minimalist one. It's something along the lines of like, you have a desire to do something, you form an intention to do it, you become aware of that intention, and then you do it. And then as long as those circumstances arise, it seems like that's a candidate for free will. And there are obviously counterexamples in the philosophy literature. And I guess my initial response to those counterexamples would be, let's restrain ourselves to extremely realistic, testable, the kinds of things we could observe empirically, as opposed to like mad neuroscientists giving you a pill that causes some strange thing to happen, and then dealing with those counterexamples. And I suppose that there could be a good one that means that I should change my mind, but I guess I'm not thinking of them right now, and that could just be my own fault.
All right, thanks very much.
Thanks. So I hope we have time for one more question. One more. And I suggest that we ask Pam to ask her question out of the chat, because it's a new type of question and a very large and important question that we all need to think about. Pam?
Okay, it was more of a comment than a question, but I do think that it dovetailed with Aaron's issue. And it was that I would have thought that what we're seeing here is that information that goes into decision making is being determined by this process, and not that the decision itself is being determined by the process. That I'm getting, so to speak, a command by the arrow, go right or go left. Whether I receive that command or how clearly I receive that command is determined by this process. But then I would have thought that would have left the actual decision making or willing or whatever we want to call, untouched.
Pamela, is for me or for Nick?
For both.
Oh, like I said, it was less a comment, but could say what you think about it, I suppose.
Right. Well, my counter comment can be that, yeah, you say how clear is the stimulus. Yes, it's exactly the nature of this. No, basically, we don't know exactly what is going on when the stimulus is masked backwardly and using the meta contrast. Even if the outputs of this kind of experiments are pretty well studied and that they're robust, we don't know still. We don't have the right definitions yet, probably, about attention, consciousness, perception in this kind of specific case. So, yeah, you say, yeah, how much clear is the stimulus? Yes, this is exactly the level of clarity of the perception of the stimulus that is determining this. And this is, I think, exactly the function of this kind of task to me. I don't know if Nick has another point.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the thought I'm having is something like, I like a lot of these questions and trying to reframe them in my mind. It's like, how could we try to test this, even maybe just with the data we already have from Ivano's results? So like one thing you might say about what you're pointing out is like, I don't know, in social psychology, we call it like a mediation analysis. In neuroscience, you might have like better ways of doing this kind of thing. But the idea is, are these button presses directly or indirectly impacted by whatever the manipulation is that Ivano is giving participants? And so if it's indirectly impacted via whatever information is available to people, as you're I think trying to suggest, then it seems like we have data about what people reported being aware of, namely in like the 4-item or 4-level scale that Ivano gave us. And I think that I included in a slide where like most people didn't seem to see anything or notice whatever they did see in the incongruent mass condition. And so we could look at like, does the degree to which people reported being aware of this information have any impact on the results? And then a prior question would be, did the manipulation have any impact on whether they were aware of it, right? So you can sort of run an indirect and a direct effect and analyze that. Again, I don't know if that's a thing in neuroscience, but it seems like that could be a testable question with the data you have, maybe?
So no, it's not. I mean, I think I'm asking a question about how we interpret the data rather than, or how we label it, rather than a question about what additional thing we need to find. So Till asks whether I think he's asking this to me, a decision-making process after the stimulus is perceived. And I wouldn't think that, what we need here is to find sequences in time. First, the information comes in, then there's another process called a decision that works on that information, and then there's an output to the motor system. But I would think that talking about concerns about freedom and intention, I mean, that the question we ask about the intention is, why did you do that? And the answer to that question would be, because I was told when the arrow points this way to go this way, and when the arrow points that way to go that way. And I thought the arrow pointed one way or the other. So that what we're actually seeing a variation in is something like a belief that's playing that functional role. And I don't mean to be talking about a temporal or processing role, but that functional role in how we understand the behavior. So that where the randomness or the effect of the brain state is coming in is at the level of the information on the basis of which I have already decided to make this decision. I have the standing intention to make this decision. So that's so it seems to me like it's getting at something about how we get information on the basis of which we do things, not as much telling us about how we decide to do things.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to intervene. We are well over time and we
Yep.
will need to stop. Even
But
though
I have to say one thing, Uri, I'm sorry, but I think this discussion has shown the truth of the title of Nick's most recent paper, Great Minds Do Not Think Alike.
Thanks for the plug.
Okay, thank you everyone very much for this, especially Ivano and Nick and Ivano Trigiani. I'm sorry I mispronounced your name.
Oh, don't worry.
Yeah, and yeah, until the next thing. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.